access later on. One thing I do want to note before we dive in is that the schedule for banding workshops, although neither of you are impacted, but the schedule for the banding workshop, so if you're listening to the recording, it's impacted this week. Actually, all of the banding workshops are moved around a little bit. So if you are a banding facilitator, please just be cognizant that your schedule might be different. Let us know if you need a facilitator to cover for you. Before we dive in, I would love to know from Haley and Kathleen, what was something that was a highlight of your week last week with Youth Champions? Did anything stand out to you?
I think what stood out to me is like it felt a little bit more comfortable, at least for me. And so I felt like the students as well kind of are getting more acclimated. I did have a larger class than the week before, so it felt a little bit more difficult to, popcorn across. But yeah, it felt a little bit more natural on my end. And I do think that they were more willing to engage, which I appreciated, even if it being, like 6 p.m. their time, 6 p.m., like, after school, like it's a little bit later of a day for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say similarly, the level of engagement, I feel like it got a little bit better towards the end of the session as
Okay.
people started to get more comfortable. Um, and it was great. I think the question specifically around um, what are like some limiting beliefs that people your age have? I think that specifically was the one where people leaned in the most. And so it was exciting to see them be able to start to connect those dots. Like we talked about last week, a little bit like a step removed from them having to talk about themselves specifically. And I think that um, did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of getting them to be able to lean in and engage a bit more.
Awesome. I love hearing that. I love it because especially I think you'll see even in the next 2 weeks, these students will start leaning in more. And it'll not just feel like Kathleen was saying, a little more comfortable and natural on your end. The first week is a lot. It's just a lot. There's a lot of newness, and there's actually just a lot of content that happens in week one, which we will probably be reworking for next year to make it a little less content driven and more about getting to know each other a little bit better. But I know that week one, it's a lot. And then week two, people start feeling more comfortable. Week 3 and 4, students, you'll start seeing them open up, but especially after our first field trip, when people get a chance to meet each other in person, those students get even more open. So that's not going to be this week or next week, but the following week, you will continue to see that like improvement. But I think that field trip really does help swing that for some people. And welcome, Jenny. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm trying to follow along on my phone because my computer is not cooperating right now. So,
Oh no. Okay. Well, we'll also send these recordings later, but
perfect.
I'm sorry your phone isn't working super well right now. Or sorry, your computer isn't working super well right now. We will go ahead and dive into this. Hopefully you can see this on your screen. We're going to talk about asking good questions this week. This is a brand new workshop for us, and it's something I'm very excited about because I think this is a very crucial skill that ends up being really hard for people, not just our students, but for adults as well, is just how do I ask a question? How do I feel bold enough to ask a question as well? So I'm going to start by setting a timer and doing this in, what's it called? 90-ish seconds, under 2 minutes, so that we get an overview before we dive in. All right, asking good questions. I'm going to go ahead and start. So we'll talk a little bit about what we covered last week. The bridge here is that last week we were critically thinking about how our brains work. This week we're turning that critical thinking outward and saying, okay, how can I think critically about the world around me? How can I ask questions about the world around me? Our goal is to learn about what creates curiosity and learn about some barriers to curiosity, and then actually just practice questions together. Here, we're going to talk about the curiosity gap. This is super fun for me. It's a lot about that idea that Sometimes we're given partial information and we want to know more. Storytellers are really good at this. Netflix documentaries are really good at this. There's so many things that we can look at and be like, oh, but what happened next? And that tension ends up creating a curiosity in a lot of ways. And that's actually a dopamine hit once we get the answer. So we'll ask a question about that and go into why asking questions is hard. So it's super rewarding to get an answer, but actually asking can be quite difficult. School doesn't teach us to do it. Sometimes we have an overload in our brain and it's hard for us to come up with questions. And a lot of times we're driven by a fear of looking dumb. So we'll ask a question about that and we'll dive into that a little more. Then we're going to work on forming questions together. We're using something called the QFT, the question formulation technique. It's going to be about taking a sentence and we're going to break this down together. So in their workbook, we're going to go step by step through asking a lot of questions, then figuring out how do I reframe these? How do I ask them better? And what are my top 3 important questions? So teach people like, okay, how do we go about learning how to ask good questions? We'll go ahead and wrap up by saying that next week we are completely switching gears to budgeting, give some time for the workbook and announcements, and then we wrap up. So I'll stop there and see that's a high-level overview of what we're doing this upcoming week. Does anyone have any questions or concerns or thoughts on a high level from that intro? Okay. Okay. I think the hardest part is going to be the question formulation technique. This is a little bit unusual and the process of going through it will be a little unusual. So we'll spend a little more time on this part. The rest of it, I think, will just be really fun to engage with students to hear what their thoughts are and start exploring questions. So I'm going to come back to the beginning. Again, we covered briefly that bridge. Last week, we covered how the brain works and how it filters things. And that we learned that, okay, it filters, but you can control some of your slow thinking processes so that you can deliberately create some new filters. It'll take time, but every filter we already have was based off of slow thinking originally, so we can rewrite some of that. And that was a lot about introspective critical thinking. How do I think critically about how my own brain works? The next step then is to think, okay, if we put that outward, how do I think critically about the world around me? I'll jump right to the curiosity gap. Curiosity gap is that tension you feel when you want to know something and you don't know it. So again, social media is a great tool for this. I think there's a reason why we get all those dopamine hits. It's because we have a question, a curiosity is created for us. We want to know more and we get the immediate satisfaction of knowing more within 15 seconds. We can be, oh, what does that haircut look like? Or what would that outfit look like? And suddenly we'll know, and it feels really good to get that curiosity satisfied. So it does trigger in us this dopamine and it feels awesome. It's part of why mysteries always feel so good to go through. So the first part here is just covering like what makes a question happen. And that curiosity is actually something we deal with on a daily basis. Even if people don't consider themselves curious by nature, actually all people are curious by nature. It's just about figuring out, where do I see that curiosity actually? So I'll pause here. Does anyone have any questions about curiosity gap or just trying to hit home to students? Like, the main point of this is to hit home to students, you are a curious person and it feels good to have questions satisfied. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, or hesitations around this?
I think the only thing is just like we're obviously talking to a different generation who has access to their phones and like how dopamine like obviously impacts them. Like I don't want to get into it because it's not like a nice thing to say like, hey, now you have like way less of a attention span and it's not your fault. But like when I see dopamine, like that's where my brain goes. And like I don't know if there's a slide, I haven't gone through all the slides to kind of highlight like, you know, we don't want to necessarily say, sorry, somebody's calling me, that like that's a bad thing, but to be aware of it because it is something that they're having to deal with is that everything's in their face, short TikTok, short reels, short everything. I work
Yeah.
in the industry now, and like that's literally the whole point of like selling to those sorts of consumers.
I love that question. I would say if you want to, I think dopamine with relation to social media and that kind of short attention span and short results is a really relatable thing that people have a lot of exposure to. But if you don't want to be like kind of implicitly condoning it, I would say choose another example. I would say tabloid says like, you'll never believe what happened. Yeah. This this woman is making all the doctors angry with her secret about how not to age or whatever it is. Those things show up all the time, and it's there's this idea in us where we're like, oh, I wonder what this is about. And I think that you could turn to some examples that are less about that immediate hit and more about that immediate curiosity.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great point. Anyone else have any thoughts or concerns or questions? All right. So the question we're going to ask is, when was the last time a question bothered you because you couldn't figure it out? What did you do next? For me, I know my examples are going to be very specific to me. I tend to, when I'm driving and when I'm going to sleep at night, suddenly have a lot of questions. I think some of those questions will be like, while I'm lying in bed, I'll be like, why is it that we always see the same side of the moon? And suddenly I'll be like trying to fall asleep, and all I can think about is the physics of moon or whatever it is. And so I know that for me, that's my example. I often get bothered by questions when I'm least actually able to access my phone. And actually, importantly, and like Kathleen says, when my brain is quiet, like I think there's a really big, beautiful thing in when a brain is not being like having a constant input, that a brain actually has some fluidity to think of some questions. And I think that's when I have the most questions that I can't figure out. And what do I do next? It depends. Sometimes I'll write down my questions. Sometimes if I'm driving, I'll call my sister and ask her these questions. It just depends for me, but that would be my example. Does anyone else have anything they'd want to talk about in this area, or an example that they're already thinking about that they're excited to share?
I'll have to think about it more.
Yeah, that's fine.
Same. Definitely some great thought starters, though.
It's such a curious, I love it, because I think one of the biggest things we face, and you may have experienced this in our workshops, is students go into the breakout rooms and then they have to ask and answer questions. And a lot of people struggle with this. So I think just even thinking like, oh, what kinds of questions do I ask? And how do I ask them? And when do I ask them is, I think, a helpful exercise to be reflective on it. Okay, so then we go into why is asking questions hard? And we're going to talk about a few things. We already talked about why getting answers is so satisfying, but here, school actually trains people to answer and not ask. You are never, or very rarely, graded on a test by the questions you asked. You're graded by how well did you answer the questions somebody else asked you. So it's about knowing the right answers. And what creates a little bit more of a difficulty with that as well is that's our frame of reference for what makes me smart is my ability to answer, and not necessarily my ability to ask. So just the environment we grow up in might not allow for a lot of that. Fear of looking stupid. I'm going to cover this one next because I'm actually going to rearrange these right now while we're talking. Oh, never mind. I'm not, because I don't know how. So I'll do overload first. Overload is the idea that if our brain is getting too much information at once, our brain starts to shut down certain faculties. Like if there's too much happening, it's not able to cover everything. It's not able to understand everything. So it starts shutting some things down. One of the things it shuts down is that curiosity and that asking questions, and more just takes things as they come. The other thing is fear of looking stupid. So humiliation actually triggers the part of the brain that is the same as the pain we feel when we have real physical pain. So people do not like to be embarrassed. It feels like in the brain similar to actual physical pain. And especially when combined with that idea that we live in a culture, I guess, where schools want you to answer the right thing, if we bring up something that's incorrect, it is so scary to think, oh, I might feel that pain of looking stupid. And that is a big reason why we might have a hard time asking questions. So I think this is a really great area for people, especially our students, to be able to air like, yeah, it sucks when I ask a question, or like I'm scared to ask a question, whatever it may be. I think this will be a really relatable part for a lot of students. So the next question we go to is less on how does that feel for you, and more about, have you ever regretted not asking a question? So here I think there is some potential for good discussion, and it's up to you how you kind of want to lead it. If you want to ask people like, hey, has anyone felt like this? And let people answer vulnerably. If you're in a workshop where you're like, people just are not ready for this yet, you can go to the next question. But just like I think Jay made a really good point last week, don't underestimate what these students are willing to share. They're actually willing to share quite a lot and open up quite a bit. But this is an area to be able to discuss. And then here, have you ever regretted not asking a question? For me, I would say my example is, and when I have the most regret, it's related to friends. Like if a friend told me they were having a really bad day, and maybe I was like, oh, I don't want to like step in this. I don't want to make them uncomfortable by asking too many questions or prying too deeply. So I'll just step back a little bit, and learning that they actually really wanted to talk about it. They were just waiting for someone to ask. And so that's kind of a moment when I feel like, oh, I really wish I'd asked more, because I would have loved to make my friend feel that good and feel like I was there to listen to them. And instead I shut them out. And I think that's my best example. But other things are just like the most basic one is I've gone to the doctor, told them what was wrong. They tell me what they think it is. And then I in my head, I'm thinking, but I don't think that's quite right. And here's why. But I'm like, well, but they're a doctor. They know. So I'll just let it go. And then later on, I'm thinking, man, I really wish I asked them, because I still have this problem that I still need fixed. We'll go on to the next area, because this one's going to be a little tricky. Learning to ask better questions, the QFT, the question formulation technique. So this is going to be a process where there's not going to be a workbook question at the end of this. This whole segment is a workbook question. So we'll start by either asking them to choose one of the options below, or choosing one for everyone to do together. Personally, for me as a facilitator, I will choose one of these and say, this is the one we're doing together. And for the sake of today, we'll say it's the technology is making us less human. So the idea to start with is just throwing out an idea, a statement, an image, a problem, something where it's has to spark curiosity, because that's what we're going to do. So we'll go with technology is making us less human. And then they're going to be asked to go through a process. They have to now jot down all the questions they have or can generate about this. Questions or statements are allowed, and we'll turn those statements into questions later. But even if it's technology is making us less human, maybe they don't even know how to start a question there. They can start with, there is more technology today than there was in the past. They can start with a statement that is just true, even if they don't have a question, and then they can formulate it into a question as they go. But what I would say is we'll give 90 seconds, like a workbook question, for them to list out as many questions as they have. Then the next step will be, oops, not that page, this one. Okay, then they're going to go through and they're going to change anything that's an open-ended like statement into a question. Then we'll give another 60 seconds for them to classify their own questions as closed or open. And as they go through, they can help change and convert questions from being closed to being open. So even though closed questions have a place, they can be really good at gathering facts. This helps redirect it into something that can be a little more open and help a little more of that discovery process. So you'll spend another 60 seconds letting them change them into open-ended questions. Then, and I think you can do this one in 30 seconds, but say, choose your top 3. Which ones do you think are most important to you, either for your learning or for that you think are most interesting? Maybe the ones you think are most impactful, whatever it is, go ahead and choose your top 3 questions. Then the last part, and again, this is more of a 30-second one, is what are you going to do about it next? Like, where would you go with this? Would you research it? Would you share it with somebody? Would you journal about it? Like, what is it that would be a good next step for you? But the main part is really to focus on the actual question generation. So this process, I think for me, what it would look like is like 90 seconds on this. We talk about it a little bit. People share in the chat. We maybe choose a couple questions from the chat and say, hey, that's really good. Why was this a question you wanted to ask? And see what students say. And so on and so forth. So as you go through, getting those opportunities to be able to say like, oh, okay, like let's share about this, or what does make a question open or closed, or even if someone's having a hard time figuring out how to rephrase a closed question, that we can discuss as a group, how do you make it open? So that's what the QFT would be, is it's a series of questions, a series of steps to break down what makes good questions. It is all here in the presentation, but another place you can find it that I would recommend maybe pulling up a little bit is the Facilitator guide. It shows it in a really like step-by-step way that might be more clear than the PowerPoint, which does the same thing, but because it's on a couple pages, it might be a little more confusing. Then we don't have a workbook question. We'll end right there and we'll talk a little bit about next class. Next class has nothing to do with this class. Next class, we're moving into our financial literacy area. So we will be talking about budgeting, but you can just basically say, hey, next week we'll talk about budgeting, and we're switching into this next area of our curriculum. Then there's some announcements. And as a reminder, our team would like about 4 or 5 minutes to do announcements at the end of workshops. And they're going to do their best to remind you during the workshop or like before the workshop, like, hey, I just need a few minutes at the end of the workshop. But for now, just consider that 5 minutes before your time is up, make sure you're wrapping up. Any questions or thoughts about any of this?
Do you guys typically integrate breakouts for this class or no?
Yes. Yeah, so for every workshop besides the first one, we do integrate breakouts. And I would say there's a few places you can put it here. Number one, people do often like putting them right at the beginning. So whether it's that you answered a poll or even after the first workbook question saying, hey, let's break into breakout groups now and talk about it. So that's an option. You could also go into breakout rooms basically for the whole QFT if you wanted to. I probably wouldn't do that personally because we don't have student leads yet, which means they're not as well equipped to actually go through this a little more challenging exercise. But it's definitely like you could do something where you go through it, have people answer it, then you go into breakout rooms and discuss like, hey, what kind of questions did you come up with? What was hard about this exercise? What was easy about this exercise? Yeah, good question, Haley. Does that help clarify where breakout rooms might go?
Yes. Yep.
Cool.
Super.
Cool. Any other questions or thoughts?
Are there poll questions that you guys already have created for this, like we did at the beginning of last one?
Yes, so the poll questions are already created. I think they are at the beginning of the PowerPoint, but they're also here in the facilitator guide. So they're listed here. If you have a different set of poll questions that you want to do, feel free to email those to our team so that they can have those in advance of your workshop.
But the
Awesome.
idea is the poll questions is something that we kind of like start the meeting with just to kind of break the ice. It's an icebreaker essentially.
It's an icebreaker. So everyone does this differently. Some
Mhm.
people hate using the polls. That's fine. For me, what I like about them personally is that there's a dead air sometimes that happens at the very beginning of a workshop. Students are trickling in for that first 1 to 2 to 3 minutes. And even though it's not a long time, it makes sense for someone to show up at a meeting 1 minute late, but that pause can feel like a really long time. And it can
Mhm.
actually also feel like a really long time for the students who are on the call already and waiting for something to happen. So for me, I use it as a way to fill up dead space so that people feel already like they're getting involved.
Love it. Yeah. And do we know if, I know that when we had on our onboarding, we had discussed like starting off with like big breakout rooms and just to kind of get everyone acquainted with one another and mixing that up. Did that start last week? I feel like since I lost last week, I'm kind of playing catch up now.
Yeah, I would say no one actually did that last week to have people do introductions, and I would say that's fine. I think that people there were a few facilitators that used breakout rooms toward the beginning of the workshop as a way for people to start getting to chat and speak up. And I think that works pretty well. But it wasn't meant to be introductory last week. And I don't think it needs to be this week. I think you can either do them at the beginning or some other time, but I would recommend doing breakout rooms.
Okay.
Awesome. I do know we're at time, so we will wrap up here. I want to respect everybody's time. Thank you so much for coming out. If you do have any questions, please let our team know. Otherwise, I'm just super stoked to see everybody's workshops this week.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. All right. See you later.
Bye.